Hi there, welcome to this build of a 49-inch wingspan Diamond Demon, a really great design from the late 1930s. Now in the last couple of videos, the first two videos of this series in fact, we got the main crutch, the main support of the fuselage finished, and we got the underside of the fuselage to get this lovely diamond shape. So essentially we've got half a diamond at the moment of this Diamond Demon. Now this Diamond Demon is going to be powered by this lovely Bantam spark ignition engine, which creates some issues really, because along with this engine we're going to need a battery, we're having an electronic switching system for the contacts, we've got a coil, we've got the HT lead, and we've got all of that which is going to produce weight, and it's going to take up space in the front of the fuselage. And as well as that, we've still got the radio control gear that we're going to have. We're going to have 2-channel radio assist, and ideally we want to have as much space between those two sets of electronics to avoid any interference with the radio control gear by the spark ignition system. So what we're going to do is we're going to get that spark ignition system as far up in the front of the plane as possible. But as you can see, there's not a lot of space in this fuselage. So some of it's going to have to go in the cabin. What I'm hoping to do is get the battery in the nose section of this plane, which is going to be a tight squeeze, but I think we can do it. Now, first things first, perhaps with some of the more traditional square fuselages, you can just put the fuselage on the bench to work on it. But when you've got a diamond-shaped fuselage, you need to do something about that so you can work comfortably. And here's my solution. Right, I've made myself a couple of really simple supports just out of a little bit of timber I had lying around, and they're just going to support the fuselage. Now as it is, they're heavy enough to just allow that to slide on and sit on there, and we can pull them forward, we can work on it. But I've got some weights and I'm putting those on the back here. I just don't like the idea of the potential for damage if they do fall forward. A couple of weights and nothing's going anywhere. So we can now work on the fuselage, we can look at it and think about what we're doing. If we're going to put the engine in, for example, and add weight to the front, then that's going to lift the back up. So the best thing we can do is just put a little bit of weight on top of the support here, just to hold that nice and steady. And now we have a good stable platform. Right, well, if we take a quick look at the components we've got for the spark ignition system. We've got a battery pack here, which I've made up myself, and this is 3 AAA N-loop Panasonic rechargeable batteries. I've got a coil, and this is one of Larry Davison's coils from the US, along with one of his transistor switching devices, and I'm going to be using that as well as one of his HT leads, and this is a suppressed one that's got a resistor in the end just close to where it clips onto the spark plug. Now if we deal with the fuselage first, have a look at this. We've got a firewall that I need to make out of 3mm 1/8 ply, and that's going to have the legs on it bent up to support the wheels. We're then going to have a couple of cheeks on the side here to make up this curved nose section. And what I'm hoping to do is to be able to cut a hole in that firewall large enough for the battery to poke through and sit in that section there with the wires coming through. I may need to shorten these wires just to make it more practical, and it will reduce a little bit of weight. But with that battery being in there, we need to make this a closed environment. So we need to put a top on it, or a bottom to the kind of the engine bay, which in itself creates a little bit of an issue as to how we get to put the nuts on the bottom of the bolts to tie the engine in. But we'll work on that as we go. The section here, now the CG, sorry, let me just point out, the CG is about there. So we want to get all of this as way forward of the CG. So we've got the battery we're going to put in the front. I'm then going to put the electronics in a piece of foam in this triangular section here. The coil I'm going to have way up, and I'm going to sit that right in the cockpit where the dashboard would be, by the front windscreen, so that's as far forward as possible. And we had a tank, didn't we, which, if I just get it out of my container down here with the bits, we also, in the last video, we made provision for the tank to just sit in there like that, which again is mostly forward of the CG. So that is kind of the rough plan. Incidentally, I'll provide a link in the description below to Larry's electronics and his ignition coils. Really great stuff this is, and nice and light. So what I'm going to do now, I think the first thing is I'm going to make up this firewall out of plywood here and the legs, and we'll get that epoxied on with a hole in, and then we'll start to think about making up these cheek sections. And I'm still not going to cover this side of the fuselage in yet. I'm going to make up a big piece of foam to fit in there to hold the electronics, to protect them from vibration. I'm also going to have a switch, like a little micro switch operated from a servo, which can switch the ignition system on and off. And I'll probably put the micro switch down here, but it will be operated from a servo way back where the electronics are, and I'll have just a plastic snake to operate that, to try and isolate those two systems. Like I say, I know I keep saying this, but as much space as we can get between them, the better. And the trick to that is starting off with this ignition system as far forward as possible. Right, well, I've really been cracking on with this now, and I've got a firewall done, or at least partially done. First of all, I just cut it fairly square so that it would fit between the engine bearers, like that, with the curve on top as on the plan for the front of the nose, the windscreen. And to get the shape, if I just take this off, to get the shape of the diamond, rather than trying to measure it up beforehand, I put it on and I've just drawn around on either side and also on the inside here. So now, if I just get this off, so now I've got the shape that I need to cut out. So I'm going to cut that out with my fret saw, and then I need to bend up the wire leg, which is basically a diamond shape. And there's a few things that we need to consider with that, and once I've got that bent up, we'll have a look at that again, and I'll discuss those. So that needs to be done. As far as, get my forceps, as far as the switch for the ignition system, which I said was going to be operated by a servo way back in the fuselage, I've made up a little bit of a casing that will house a micro switch, and you can see it's just a simple push switch, very easy to push, and I'm going to use a really small light servo, and I'm going to glue that somewhere like that in there, and then we can just push this in from the top, and we can put a couple of bolts in there, just slot them in, and that will hold that nice and secure. And then we have a push rod, like I say, from this side of the fuselage, just pushing it to switch it on and off. And I've done a little bit of a step, I don't know whether that shows there, you can just see on that front edge there's a little bit of a step where the switch pushes up against it to hold it just in the right place. And as I said, I've got a couple of holes here where I'm just going to push a bolt in. I've put CA around here to strengthen it, and those bolts aren't going to be bolted in, they're just going to be pins, and because this is packed in foam around here, they won't vibrate out, hopefully. Well, with regards to the foam, I've cut a more or less triangular piece of foam that just fits in there quite nicely. And now you can see the benefits of not sheeting that side yet. And that will not only provide something for the fuel tank to sit on, vibration, insulation from the foam, but I'm going to cut that slot in and this will just slot down into there. Still a little bit high here, but we'll adjust that when we cut the slot in and when we know the exact height for the fuel tank. But that just fits in great there. I'm quite pleased with that. Right, I've now got this former cut to shape and I've got my hole cut in, which will allow my battery to go through into the nose section. I've also drilled holes, because we can focus in on that, drilled holes all around, because the undercarriage that I've just bent up, I'm going to sew into place. This is 3mm music wire. I've bent it cold in the vise with a hammer, and I always bend it like that, and providing it's good quality music wire, it doesn't fracture or break. I've never had it fracture or break, so that's how I do it. I'm going to sew that into place like that, and that will allow the battery still to go through. I could have had it slightly lower down like that and had the hole in the top, but that would have severely weakened this top area of the firewall. So much better to have a steel frame going round to provide strength to the outside of the firewall there. That'll be lovely and strong once it's done. Well, I've now got the engine mounted on the front, or at least I've got the holes drilled with a couple of degrees right thrust, and I've trimmed the engine bearers back a little bit to allow the timer lever to come down unhindered, and also the electrical contact for the points to come round unhindered. And if I just take this off the stand, you can see that's just mounted on there, and it's not bolted on, it's just held there for the moment. You can see I've got the firewall fitted with the landing gear. Now this, as I said earlier, I haven't glued this front edge, I haven't glued the stitching, and I will do that, but I will do it once I've got the cheeks in place, because I don't want the glue to go on the mating surfaces there and hinder it sort of coming together nicely. But I have glued the whole of the back of that firewall and the stitching. Hopefully that shows there. So that is nice and secure, the firewall to this former and all of the stitching. And we've got the hole which the battery can go through. Now the next job with this is to build up this nose section. I now have an idea how I'm going to do this nose section, and as we said earlier, the priority is that the battery will slide through and sit there under the engine, and this needs to be in a sealed compartment. So I'm going to have the cheeks that go on, one either side, and then between those cheeks on top of the battery there's going to be a little bit of a platform like that, angled down. Now the reason it's angled down is because, if I just get some bolts, when we've got the engine fitted like this, I'm going to need to push the bolts up through the engine mount and through the lugs from the underside. I can't do it from the top. I can on this side, but we've got the exhaust outlet on this side. Just move that around a little bit. I've got the exhaust outlet there, and that won't allow me to get bolts down. So the bolts need to come from underneath. So this, if it's angled enough, will allow me to put the bolts in from the front, and I can use a shortened Allen key to hold the heads while I put nuts on the top. Right, well now this is really starting to take shape. Cheeks are on, We've got the thick balsa in the front that's been sanded and profiled for that lower section, and we've got this piece of 2.4mm balsa that is going to form the floor of the engine bay. I'm going to glue that in a minute, but you can see the battery is below there, and you can get the battery in and out with that floor in without too much problem. It's a little bit fiddly, but it's not something that's going to happen all the time. Now if I take that out, you can see in there, hopefully I've started to glue the stitching with epoxy, and I've got a little bit more of that to do just to make sure it's nice and secure. So I'm going to get the epoxy in there around the stitching. We'll get this floor in, a little bit of balsa just at the back there because there's a little bit of a gap, and then we need to make up the front of this with a little bit of a hole for the front of the engine to come out, and of course that all important access to get these bolts up and under into the engine mounting. Right, we've now got this to a stage where I'm happy we've got the nose and the underside finished for now. And yes, it's going to need a bit more work, profiling, making sure everything fits just right, but we're at a stage now where we want to move on to the top. But we'll have a quick look at what we've done so far. Well, as you saw earlier, we got the engine mounted, and now we can get the bolts in from around here with a pair of forceps to lift them up on this side, particularly where we can't get them down because of the muffler, and we can get an Allen key in there. We've got the battery compartment built in here, and we can see we've got the lead coming out. We'll have a closer look at that in a minute. This is all going to need some profiling. These edges will be rounded a little bit, but particularly this top edge here. But I want to get the top of the fuselage on top of the crutch finished before we start profiling this. Better to do it all as one. So if we take the engine off, we've got the compartment there below, as I said earlier, but we've also got this drain hole to allow any fuel or oil to run out if it does get spilt in here. Hopefully this engine's not going to be too mucky. Now we've got the fuel tank sat on foam, and if we just take that out, we can see we've got a depression in the foam for the fuel tank to sit in, and it'll be packed by more foam to keep it in place. We've got the slot in the foam here, which the ignition system for the contacts will slide in. Again, that's going to need some proper fitting once we come to fitting the whole thing out, but it's there ready just to be modified a little bit. Oh, and the coil will sit on the front there above the fuel tank, but that will be done once we've finished doing the cabin and the windscreen and everything, so we know how much room we've got to play with. Now if I take this foam out, you can see I still haven't sheeted this yet. I will do at some point, but it'll probably be one of the last things I do. If we take out the foam, obviously it will come out the top once it's been sheeted. We've got the battery totally hidden there under the nose, and that comes out fairly easy. We've got the switch mounted that we looked at earlier with the bolts there for the to hold the switch in, and we're just going to have a micro servo that just pushes that switch on and off, and I don't know whether you can hear that clicking or not. Let me just do that, and that's quite a nice smooth action. And I'm going to use a really light servo. This, I think this weighs about 5 grams, and I'm going to mount this back here in the fuselage like that, something like that I believe. But I don't want to do that until I know exactly where the radio gear is, so I'm leaving that bit of the build for a later date. Well, I've really enjoyed getting this nose section finished and laying the groundwork for the installation of the engine and the ignition system, and everything we've done so far has been forward of the CG point. But now I'm going to draw this video to a close, and in the next video I'm going to be working on the top of the fuselage. So we're going to get the nose section, the cabin, and finishing off this diamond on the turtle deck of the fuselage. So I hope you'll come back and see how we get on in the next video completing this, and I hope you found this video useful and interesting. So thanks very much for watching.